Stanek. Bryan is our Vice President of Specialized Industries, and he is going to help us better understand carbon markets. So Bryan, welcome, and let's start off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here at Compeer.
Sure, Sarah, and thanks for inviting me on today. This is going to be a pretty educational event for folks, I hope. First off, I've got about 20 plus years in the farm credit system, worked as an account officer back in the day, and then have sort of moved along in different specialties within my career. At this point in my life, I find myself helping to serve those clients that work in many specialized industries, such as potatoes, timber, cranberries, dairy, and then we have a leasing portfolio too. One of the side projects that I picked up since COVID was obviously trying to put some work in the carbon market space. And it's quickly developing, and there's a lot of moving parts that we needed some centers of information within the farm credit system and Compeer itself. And so I stepped up and tried to organize some of that along with the team and myself to get there. So great to be here, and hopefully we can cover some stuff that would be interested to those interested in carbon market space.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like we have the right guy for the job. So let's start at the beginning. What are carbon markets? What's the history? Help us understand that.
Yeah, that's a pretty common question. About 2 years ago, when we first started looking at the carbon market spaces as a whole, a team was brought together at Compeer, and I don't want to be the only one taking credit for this work. There was several people that surrounded this project work. There was Joe Stevens and Todd Slock out of Illinois, Joe Stevens out of Wisconsin. And what we started really was the basics, 101. Where did it all start from? What was the history? And how did it end up today? And so that question really gets us started. And we really had to dig back a little bit in history to figure out what really drove the carbon markets to be here. Essentially, carbon markets are exchanging for it's coined in its own light, right? So carbon is the exchange of money for the offsetting consequence of putting carbon somewhere where it can't be released to the atmosphere. But it's got such a bigger history than that. It goes back even to the time, if you go back to, give me 1 second, the UN Conference of Parties in 1995 were set off. And that was quite a ways ago, before I even graduated high school. They set forth a charter to say, look, there was some thought that the globe was warming at that point. Global warming was just getting to be newsworthy for a lot of folks. And they said, hey, we really need to start studying this and looking at where this is going. Flash forward to 2009, 2013, some bigger laws were enacted just for the United States. And mainly out of California at the time. It was called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard and Cap and Trade. Those two have literally set the paradigm and shift in the United States of how we belong to sequester carbon to soil, how much natural gas or how much gases need to be removed from the atmosphere, and sort of set in motion the ball within the U.S. of how we align with what was called the Paris Accord. So the Paris Accord was basically the nations of the world got together 2009, and they said, hey, we really think that we need to set some standards in place globally. Europe was really the first ones to launch into the carbon market space, and they quickly joined hands and said, hey, all right, we'll set our targets and we'll set this in motion. And at that point in time, there was a public exchange set up to exchange carbon credits for carbon sequestration. But then also there was different countries set different targets of their own. Since then, it's been a global movement. There's been a lot of initiatives that have come out of Europe, and it's blanketed. Most of the world has been impacted through commerce in regards to setting in motion the action of trying to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And that's where it led in today, and it led into a little thing called ESG, and I think we'll talk about that in here in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think that's a natural segue into my next question. Helpful to understand the history there, but really, where did these markets come from? And I think that really connects in with that ESG movement that you're going to talk about.
Yeah, ESG is a movement. And those folks that are listening to this today, if you've listened to anything in markets and read any newspapers lately, you've probably bumped into the coined word ESG. And what that really is an acronym for environmental social governance. It's a movement. It was established a long time ago It actually had some roots with the UN Secretary General back in 2004. Kofi Annan actually had written a letter to the World Banking Association that said, hey, we really need to be thinking about where our money is being invested in the world, what our capital is doing to the world, what our businesses and what our stewards and what our people of the world are doing to this planet. And it was a concern. It was a letter that was written by him. I mean, obviously, a UN secretary does carry a little bit of clout for U.S. commerce. And that really coined in a word that was set even before, or just a year after that. There was an article written by Ivan, I hope I pronounced right, Ivan Knopel, actually wrote a letter talking about what the UN secretary was really visiting about. And Ivo actually had written an article called Who Cares Wins? And in there, he had mentioned ESG. And ESG itself is controversial, right? Compeer isn't here to make sure that we coin ourselves as one. It's a lose-lose situation to say, one, we believe in global warming or we don't believe in global warming. You're just not going to win that conversation. ESG itself is a national movement that attaches it's a worldwide movement that attaches itself through different understandings of one, what is the definition of what one company is doing over another, and what some money is earned in different ways. And what's happened is a lot of companies are starting to realize that consumer demand surrounds the movement of ESG. And I'll give you one quick example, Sarah. What happens is different notions of what harms the environment or what may be not healthy for us as humans gets established. I'll give you the one example of RBST. For those dairy farmers that might be listening to this webcast or this Facebook Live event, RBST is actually a naturally occurring hormone within dairy cattle that actually allows dairy cattle to let down milk more efficiently through their biological processes. As anybody knows that's in the dairy industry, RBST doesn't exist now as an added booster for cattle, other than just the natural occurring hormone that's in dairy cattle today. Most consumers wouldn't know that. There was no proven facts behind the RBST movement. There was really just the notion that somehow it was harmful, even though it's a naturally occurring hormone. And it literally only took a handful of years to sweep from East Coast to West Coast. And you'd be hard pressed to even find anybody that talks about it anymore. That's ESG in somewhat of a symbiosis nature. That ESG is really a cultural movement towards an attitude of how we're using our money and what we're doing by driving hydrocarbon-driven cars, what's it doing to the world, and by cutting down forests, by utilizing land, water, all the resources of the world. ESG sets that marketplace in motion for carbon marketplaces to exist. And what we need to know is that one person's not going to get in the way of that. Obviously, everybody needs to do their part of education. We need to make sure that we stay in touch with what's fact, what's reality. Understand that ESG, as it's defined, is really contrary to capitalism. It says, hey, we're going to want people to invest in things that make us feel good and might do better than one product over another. It has some fight there in capitalism. So we just recognize that a lot of consumer demand, pension funds, capital funds, are demanding now some sort of a report back to what humans, what those companies, what those leaders are doing with the ESG standards back to carbon. And how that all relates back is politically seen. We can see it all over politics today, and we'll get to that later. But obviously, those carbon marketplaces are very attached. They've been in Europe for more than a decade. As I said before, the low carbon fuel standard, the cap and trade that are out of California. There are 16 states that actually have now greenhouse gas standards throughout the United States. Even though that's still small in comparison, it's the major economic engines of the United States, okay? And so getting in the way of that's going to be real tough. So what do farmers have to do? They got to understand that ESG is here and that the carbon marketplace attached themselves to an understanding of what one can do and what one company can do to offset those ESG movement type qualities that those funds and investors are looking for.
That's incredibly interesting, Bryan. I think, when we look at the animal agriculture side of things, or even maybe crops that are grown more directly for eating, our produce, we hear so much about consumer demand and that consumer choice really driving what happens on our farms. And so I didn't realize the connection that carbon markets had back to us investing maybe in what makes us feel good, talking about that ESG and how that connects in with the carbon markets, and that continues to affect us in the agriculture industry. So I greatly appreciate that background. I know others will be interested to understand that as well. So let's talk a little more directly about carbon markets. How does it work and how is carbon calculated?
Yeah, so 101. Obviously, there's a whole side of this equation that those say that carbon released to the atmosphere warms the atmosphere, right? I mean, that's the argument that global warming advocation is going to take. And if you can measure carbon it by any given amount from whatever activity you're doing, whether it's growing agriculture, whether it's the production of agriculture, industries as a whole, that measurement as it's known is really a CI score. It's a carbon index score. And those carbon index scores are granted by those aggregators of carbon credits that say, knowing the science behind a release of what a hydrocarbon would be out of gasoline, for instance. 100 gallons of gasoline would release 1 ton of carbon to the atmosphere. You can Google that one. That's everywhere on the internet. But 100 gallons is arguably 3 months worth of gasoline, right? Or not 3 months, 2 months worth of gasoline. And I wouldn't even want to beg the cost of it right now, right? Hydrocarbons are the major target in all of the carbon in the greenhouse gas space, right? So attaching CO2 to the atmosphere can be reduced by driving less. It's not arguable. It is fact. The argument is whether or not it warms the atmosphere. I'm not going to go there today. What I will say is that if you take 100 gallons of gasoline and what carbon is trading for on the market today, if you can sequester a ton of carbon to a forest or to the soil, or you reduce your carbon footprint in some way, that carbon is worth anywhere between $15 and $40 a ton. I mean, it does vary by the intensity of the carbon and where it's sold and who bought it. But mathematically, you can equate that back to, easy math back to that 100 gallons of gas. It ends up being anywhere between 25 and 40 cents a gallon for that gasoline to be run through your car and offset back to the industry. Now, I'm not just picking on the gasoline industry out there. In fact, they do a fine job of supplying energy to this nation. What I am saying is that you can equate anybody that is releasing carbon to the atmosphere in 1 ton increments, and those 1 ton increments can be sold in the open market through either voluntary space. The voluntary space would be companies that are wanting a good ESG image. Okay, Microsoft would be a great example of that. Truly, they probably release some carbon to the atmosphere, right? Because they're developing software and they run computers off electricity, right? But they do want a very good image out there. And so they're willing to pay on the open market voluntarily for that carbon to be offset because it's hard for them to reduce it. Another example would be airlines. We're not exactly flying airlines on electricity at this point. You're going to be flying airlines with diesel for a very, very long time, jet fuel for a very long time. For us to take that trip across the nation, you're going to release the hydrocarbon to the atmosphere, right? It's going to atomize the atmosphere. The only way they can really offset that footprint is, one, either make an airplane that flies more efficiently, or go to the open market and make sure somebody is offsetting that carbon with some sort of a standard, with some sort of verification, and then pay them the difference to make that happen, okay? And then there's the compliance market. The compliance market is what we talked about before. Largely, the compliance market is driven by California. California right now does have the California Air Resource Board, and they do enact, they track and they'll monitor emission standards and targets, and they do have some very strict targets that are out there. And they'll set up an exchange for that compliance to happen, so commerce can happen within California, which, by the way, California is like the 6th largest economy of the world, right? So are we going to change what California's mandates are? No. Okay. In fact, they have a little law out there called all electric by 2035. It was actually Governor Newsom a couple years back had signed an executive order. It's not law, but executive order that says all new vehicles need to be emissions free by 2035 that are bought in California. And so those things set in motion that public market space to be exchanged. We know these companies want to offset their carbon, and then we need those intermediaries in between to help set up those markets so farmers and other industries and what have you can actually achieve benefit by doing what they expect to offset the carbon and the greenhouse gas release from the atmosphere.
Awesome. So let's talk, we've talked a bit about agriculture and how this all came to be, but let's take a step outside of the agriculture industry for a second. What other industries are involved in carbon markets or similar efforts?
Yeah, and there's really three main targeted greenhouse gases that are out there. Carbon dioxide is the easy one, right? That's hydrocarbons from release of fossil fuels. Methane. Okay, so our animal ag segment right now is in target of methane. Methane it does hold a lot of heat, and it does atomize the atmosphere readily. So that's one that's being chased. So that would be from your low carbon fuel standards. If you can sequester methane out of the manure digesters on our dairy operations or swine operations, there are companies willing to pay for that to happen, and the math behind that's significantly different. And then there's nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide, of course, as we're out in the fields today, 90 degrees in Wisconsin here, that the nitrogen that they're putting on the field, the fertilizer they're putting on, does release nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. So again, not taking a side here, but just saying there are opportunities in all those markets right today for those industries to access for the carbon market space if they so wish.
Awesome. I do just want to take a second, Bryan. We have several folks who are watching live, so make sure to drop your questions in the comments if you have them. We have a few more questions we're going to go through, but we've got Bryan here to answer your questions. And for those who happen to catch the recording, of course, also drop your questions in the comments. We'll see those come through and we will answer them whenever they come to us. We know folks are out busy planting. We finally got some good weather, so we'll watch for those comments over the coming weeks. So, Bryan, my next question for you is, what role is the government taking in the carbon markets?
Yeah, and we're pretty fortunate at Compeer. We actually have a government affairs officer that does stay in touch with what's happening on Capitol Hill, and I think it benefits not only Compeer but the farmers as a whole if we can advocate in the right direction. As of today, the government really wants to be involved in today's government wants to be very involved in offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. It's a no-brainer, right? I mean, it's said all over the political airways. The President of the United States, the House, Congress today, they're doing everything they can to try to facilitate that agenda. There's a few things that have stalled. Okay, obviously we're sitting in a interim election year here for Congress and Senate. I'll tell you that there's a little bill called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, and it did originally pass the Senate. It's stalled in the House. That bill alone would set not only funding, but put more of a demand on the USDA to play a bigger role in the marketplace and making sure there's access to the marketplace and funding to the marketplace. As with any bill, it can change form before it ever gets enacted or signed by the president. But that one has our keen interest on it because I think there's not only financial incentives built into it, but we also don't want to see a stick. That's the last thing that farmers really want is they're doing their part. They're stewards of their land, and they take very good care of this earth. The last thing they want is another stick coming at them saying, hey, you need to address these standards. That's not the case in this bill. This bill is more of an access point for that the government's saying that the USDA can set up for folks to access these voluntary and compliance markets. So it's in some ways it's in some ways good for the government to be involved, but in some ways bad. And I wish we had another 2 hours to talk about that, but certainly I think we'll see the evolution of this marketplace take place. There is one more that's out there, and we call it the $1 billion lottery. There's the USDA actually grabbed $1 billion from the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, and they're putting this $1 billion up to bid for any company or any organization that's willing to produce climate smart friendly initiatives, programs, and maybe develop further carbon sequestration technology, whatever it has behind it. That's actually the period's closing on that really quick if it hasn't already. They're going to find a way to invest that $1 billion into this space through private enterprise, through not-for-profits, those type of things. And so stay tuned. I think you're going to see some big moving parts. Maybe some of our carbon aggregation market players out there will be putting forth some activity to grab some of that cash to put into play. But those are really the two main things that are moving in the government right now.
Awesome. Well, I know we've really spent some considerable time setting the stage, but important details to understand. So let's really start to get into the details now. Why is Compeer involved, and what does our involvement look like?
Well, first off, Compeer Financial is part of the farm credit system, okay? And one thing we have in our team sites is, one, we want to make sure we're advocating for farmers. We really don't want to, we just want to make sure that what is being told to the farmer space is accurate, as good as we can find it. We offer as a resource of information, be able to point farmers in the right direction on questions of topics they may have in regards to carbon. It's a little bit of the Wild West out there with carbon right now. Even though it's been established for a number of years in Europe and even in North America with Canada, the United States is rather still immature with this in regards to agricultural's target to greenhouse gas capture. So if we can play a role for a reliable access point, be a role for reliable information, we win. And I think the farmers that we serve win on that activity. Recognize that 50% of our corn today gets chewed up by ethanol. And I'm going to let this soak in for a minute, that if California says they want to be all electric by 2035, how does that impact everybody that's outside planting today, working hard, being stewards of their land? When 50% of our ethanol goes, or when 50% of our corn goes to ethanol, what the impact just to the biofuels market? And what could that have? What impacts could that have to land and other industries? I think we care, and we care strongly about that. We want to make sure that we're not only a voice, but helping connect the dots there so there's reasonable and rational information sources for folks to get to. I think we will see California still lead. I think we're going to see many more states take a play here. We have developed carbon markets access that we think are good access points for farmers to get to. And we will keep investing in that area. I think there's some advocacy on what farmers do. I was visiting with my friends at S&P Global, IHS Market, I think is what they were known as. And one of them says there's actually a thing called the organic lift of grain, right? So most farmers expect to grow more corn this year than what they grew last year. I mean, they should through the technology and with the same resources. So why wouldn't we want to credit them for that carbon lift that they're organically trying to achieve anyways, right? So there are some things that could be worked on out here in this space, and we're going to try to stay involved and make sure that we're advocating for the right things and pointing our aggregators that we work with in order to achieve that result. And we believe that the romance that helping agriculture can also benefit agriculture through maybe even higher payment for their carbon because they do help the earth in so many ways.
Yeah, certainly. It sounds like our involvement is important from two levels. It's us having a good understanding, making sure that agriculture and farmers have a seat at the table, but it's also making sure that our clients, our farmers, understand these programs and where the opportunity lies, which I think transitions us well. We had a question come in from Seth, and he's wondering how we're going to be inclusive of farmers that have been using regenerative practices, meaning, will only new practices qualify, or if you've been doing something for years, maybe generations, will that be rewarded as well? So maybe this transitions well into our question of who's a good fit? Is this only for people implementing new practices, yep, or if you already have these going on, is this a good fit for you?
Well, and Seth's got a great question there, and it does have some controversy tied to it, right? I mean, obviously these are newer markets. I'll repeat that again. There are a lot of good companies out there advocating for agriculture to try to get access to these markets and get that money going their way. One of the blocks in this market is the promise of sequestering carbon and the contract of sequestering carbon is the idea that you can pull more carbon out today than what you were doing yesterday. And sometimes, even though we had the best farmers in the world who had done cover crops or regenerative practices in the past, they get left out of that marketplace today. And it can actually irritate some folks like, hey, I was a real good steward of this land. Why aren't I getting rewarded for this? Just know there are a lot of companies out there advocating for that to happen. There has been some pilots that have back paid farmers for their activity of sequestering carbon. Realize that if you're on the buyer side of that equation, again, I don't mean to throw names out there, but there's a lot of big companies out there, Google, Microsoft, Delta, Disney. They're all looking for their way to offset that ESG carbon footprint. For them to prove it to their shareholder or their investor, they have to have some sort of a documentation that more carbon was offset tomorrow than what it is today. That's the whole marketplace, right? Science needs to catch up. And I do believe it's going to happen, Seth. I think you're going to see our farmers win in this further down the road. In fact, even next week, I'm part of a conference call with a major North American carbon aggregator that wants to talk about regenerative ag and what it can benefit on and how we can build that science around that. It's going to take some investment by the government. It's going to take some private investment to get us there. In fact, I know of one major carbon group out of Minnesota that is really advocating that they can get there. And I wish them the best. I really want to partner with them and say, hey, let's do this. And I think that's going to take place. Today, the facts are the facts. These companies want more carbon sequestered out of the air tomorrow than today. That's all we can deal with as of today. But recognize that's not that old. It's 24 months old. It's 36 months old in the United States. I think we need to give it some time. I think the science will catch up, and I do believe there's plenty of, again, advocacy taking place to make that happen.
Certainly. Well, I appreciate your explanation on that. I can definitely understand where the frustration comes in when you've been doing, right by the land and by the environment for so many years, but helpful to know kind of the other side of that equation too, and what the goal is for the companies who are buying these. So let's talk about timing. So if someone wants to get involved with this, they're looking at implementing some of those new practices. When's the right time to start getting involved, asking questions, learning more?
Yeah, that's another good question. And any time is the right time to look at this market. And that's what I said, look, okay, know that if you're in timber, you own forest ground, major tracts of forest have a complete advantage here. They're the oldest market, okay? So if someone has a very large tract of timber, 5,000 acres or bigger, they should be giving us a call. They should be looking on the internet and finding those access points to their accessibility. Because again, the science behind timber is where the carbon market really has started. It's the easiest. Photosynthesis, you can calculate out the board foot of growth in trees, the biological growth rate of trees. That's the easy one, okay? For your row crop farmers that are out there and working hard today, and hopefully not on this WebEx, but I hope they're on here, but hopefully they're working their tails off to get everything planted. Know that row crop agriculture can look at many different programs right now. Iowa State had a really good comparative out there of all the different programs that are out there. We did our due diligence and study behind this too. They can actually access those carbon markets at any time. The best time for them to look is ahead of their next planting season, because really the major areas of carbon payment right now for row crop agriculture is cover crop and change of tillage. Trust me, there's not enough money out there for anybody to go change their practice to that today. But there is enough science behind it to prove that one, in the right conditions, in the right area, it may be what you might be surprised at how much nutrient lift you get by cover crop and such. Pair that with the carbon payment that's out there, that can happen. So I would promote those farmers after they're done planting, reach out to your Compeer crop insurance agent or your Compeer loan officer, and we'll talk to you. We'll help you point in the right direction. Attend the seminars. Make sure you reach out, because there are deadlines. I mean, you obviously want to make sure you sign up before the crop is growing or before the practice has changed. Those that have the best practices today that apply to row crop agriculture for the carbon market, such as no-till and minimum till, you can qualify for payments, okay? You can qualify, especially if you're picking up new rented land. Maybe you bought some new land that's out there. Maybe you're changing the type of cover crop that you're doing on your operation. Don't discount it. Just make sure you start the conversation early, and then we can help sequester the right documentation to try to help make that happen for you in an easier task than doing it on your own.
Absolutely. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our conversation. I have just one last question for you, wondering how folks can go to learn more about this.
Yeah, obviously it's nonstop. This is a moving market, and I would say stay well read. Attend your different symposiums and conventions out there. It seems like carbon is the main topic. I know I was visiting on Brownfield Ag just a short time ago, and I want to give them a big shout out. I mean, they gave us some time on the airways They have some good material out there and links to this. Believe it or not, YouTube has some great stuff out there. Van Trump actually had posted a carbon symposium, and it would have been last fall, where they brought together 6-8 producers to talk about carbon. It's not hard to find that stuff. Listen to it. What you really want to do is get your access point to the aggregators of carbon, though. Okay, so if it's folks like us, or like I said, there's at least a dozen companies out there offering access points at this point. Lean into them and say, hey, I'd like to visit with one of their representatives, and let's learn what their product can do for us. For now, if they don't know where to go, said reach out to someone in Compeer, and we've got those folks aligned for you, and we can make sure that we try to bring what we think is really the relevant stuff to know today, and maybe some of the truth in the marketplace, and try to advocate for tomorrow.
Absolutely. Great advice. Well, with that, we will wrap up our conversation. For anyone who is watching the recording, please make sure to leave your questions in the comments. When Bryan and I first chatted about getting this on the calendar, we definitely hoped the planting would be wrapped up by the middle of May. So fully acknowledge this was not the most ideal timing, but we will have the recording up on our Facebook page and our YouTube account for anyone who's interested in watching. And as Bryan mentioned, make sure to reach out to your Compeer financial officer or your insurance officer if you want to learn more and find out if this is a good fit for your farm. So with that, thank you, Bryan, and thank you everyone else. Have a great evening.
Be safe, everybody.